What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. So yeah, there comes a moment in every conflict when the fighting itself stops being the main story, and the end becomes the battlefield. We are now at that very moment. Every drone strike, every sanctions package, every speech delivered in Washington or Brussels, every mobilization wave in Russia, all of it is being measured against one terrifying question. How does this all end? We're almost 4 years into the most devastating European war since 1945. A war that reshaped economies, tore apart families, destroyed cities, adjusted security doctrines, and forced nations to confront questions they have not asked in generations. And yet, if you look beyond the daily news cycles, a strange truth emerges. Nobody wants to say what the end might look like, because every possible conclusion carries enormous consequences. For Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe, for the United States, for the whole wide world. But this silence also hides a deeper fear. The fear that the ending is not controlled by those who started the war. That the outcome is no longer driven by strategy, but by desperation, exhaustion, and political survival. And in this terrifying vacuum of uncertainty, 3 scenarios form in front of us, each one frightening in its own way. Ukrainian victory, Russian victory or imposed deal, and the lingering possibility of a frozen conflict that drags on for years, if not decades, silently killing hope more effectively than any missile ever could. So today, let's look beyond the present and examine the potential endings. What's that Putin's evil plan behind all that? And more importantly, what each outcome would mean not only for the battlefield, but for the lives and futures of the millions. Let's start with the most dramatic and, for many watching today, the most emotionally charged possibility. Ukraine wins. Now, what does winning even look like? For Ukraine, the goal is straightforward. Complete liberation of their territory, including Donbass and Crimea, no compromise, no bargaining chips, no slicing away pieces of the country like spoiled cake. Simple as that. Straight to the point. Makes sense. A Ukrainian victory would mean Russian forces are pushed back to the internationally recognized borders. It means the collapse of Russia's territorial ambitions. It means Ukraine reclaiming control not only of land, but of sovereignty, dignity, and the right to exist without the constant threat of invasion. But such an outcome is not merely militarily, it is political. A Ukrainian victory would shatter Vladimir Putin's personal myth of invincibility, which he, as you guys know, cultivated for like a quarter of a century with obsessive precision. It would expose every lie in the Kremlin told about NATO aggression, about Nazis hiding under every Ukrainian bed, about Russia's destiny. And just imagine the internal reaction within Russia. The propaganda, the slogans, the economic sacrifices, the mobilization, the funerals, the shattered lives. If all of this end in defeat, what will happen? That would completely break something fundamental, something fragile, something the Kremlin cannot rebuild. A Ukrainian victory would also send shockwaves across the entire world, because it would prove that the global order still matters, that borders cannot simply be erased because one man in Moscow feels nostalgic. It would rewrite how countries behave. It would tell China what happens if it tries the same in Taiwan. It would humiliate dictators everywhere who are convinced that the West is weak, slow, and incapable of defending its allies. And it would re-establish NATO not as a defensive bureaucracy, but as a powerful geopolitical backbone. Economically, Ukraine's victory would open the door for reconstruction, foreign investment, and European Union integration. It would turn Ukraine into a symbol of resistance and rebirth, receiving unprecedented aid to rebuild cities turned to ash. In Russia, the economy, already battered and stripped to the future, would tilt into a more severe crisis. Because why would Europe return to Russian gas pipelines, ports, or supply chains after victory? Why would investors trust Moscow ever again? A Ukrainian win is not just a geopolitical defeat for Russia, it is a death sentence for Putin's imperial illusions. Which is exactly why the Kremlin fears it more than anything else. Let's talk about the opposite scenario where Russia wins or somehow forces a favorable deal for itself in the future in our next chapter. Russia does not collapse. Ukraine does not regain territory. The war bleeds Ukraine dry, Western support weakens, and Moscow forces a deal favorable to Russia. Maybe Ukraine is pressured into accepting a ceasefire with current borders. Maybe occupied regions are recognized as Russian territory. Maybe the conflict ends not with parades but with humiliation negotiated at the conference table. This outcome is not unimaginable, but it is most probable, unfortunately, at least for now. Because from Russia's perspective, winning, quote-unquote, does not require a glorious military actual victory. Russia just needs to avoid defeat, simple as that. That alone would be presented a triumph. Russian propaganda will make sure for this to happen. If Russia holds territory, if Ukraine gives up land, if the West grows tired, if unity fractures, then Kremlin propaganda will sing about destiny fulfilled, and Putin himself can declare immortality. That he alone defeated NATO, broke Western will, and secured territory with blood and steel. Internally, this scenario offers temporary stability. The Kremlin could sell it as the greatest achievement of the modern era, a new Stalin moment, kinda, a righteous conquest even. Russian propaganda channels would celebrate for years. New medals, new textbooks, new statues, new history. Schools teaching children that Russia reclaimed historic ground stolen by wicked neighbors. A dangerous precedent powered by nationalism rather than by truth, if you think about it. But the consequences to the world would be catastrophic, because it would show that brute force works. It would tell dictators everywhere, if you invade your neighbor and hold long enough, the world moves on, simple as that. It would redefine diplomacy and incentivize aggression. Nations would reassess alliances, vulnerable border regions everywhere, from the Baltics to the Balkans, from the Caucasus to Taiwan. All of these regions would suddenly look like targets again. And most dangerous of them all, Russia would not stop. I mean, why would it? If it already succeeded in Crimea, then in the second invasion, if the first war proved profitable, what prevents another? Moldova, now Georgia, Kazakhstan, the rest of Ukraine, why not? The logic becomes horrifyingly linear. Victory leads not to stability, but to expansion. Economic consequences would also be grim. Sanctions would likely remain blocking Russian development, and meanwhile Ukraine, divided and wounded, would face a lost generation. The dream of prosperous European Ukraine would evaporate. Millions more would emigrate, and the future would belong to those fleeing, not rebuilding. However, there is a third scenario. A scenario that entails decades of uncertainty, anxiety, tension, and paranoia of conflict resuming any day. That's like literally living inside a house with a wood-burning stove next to a gas station. Let's talk about it in our next chapter. Now let's consider potentially the most haunting possibility of them all. Not Ukrainian triumph, not Russian victory, instead a permanent, simmering stalemate. A frozen conflict. Something like Korea, something like Kashmir, something like Transnistria. No peace, no war, just a deadly pause stretched across decades. In this scenario, the front lines stabilize, the fighting slows, but nothing is resolved. Russia still holds territory legally, Ukraine refuses to recognize it, like the rest of the world most likely, and diplomacy remains an open wound. The front line becomes a scar across an entire civilization. Ukraine cannot fully rebuild, Russia cannot move forward, the West cannot disengage, the world cannot relax. This is the outcome people fear because it just feels realistic and very potential as well. And also depressing and endless. Frozen conflict traps millions in uncertainty. Ukraine would spend years restructuring its army. Every young man and woman would live with the knowledge that fighting might resume at literally any moment. Families would exist in permanent tension. Psychological prison without walls, kinda. Russia, meanwhile, would continue militarizing its society, feeding the war machine not out of hope but from habit of fear and collapse. And here is the part that nobody wants to say out loud. Frozen conflicts reward corruption, reward authoritarianism, reward propaganda. It creates generations raised under brainwashing bombs rather than the real ones. It makes peace a distant memory, not a future goal. Frozen conflict is not an end. It's life support administered to prevent death, not recovery. Just survival. And eventually survival itself becomes suffering. Let's step back and examine the global stakes, because no matter how this ends, the world will not be the same after. If Ukraine wins, a message is sent loud and clear. Borders matter, sovereignty matters, imperialism dies under pressure. Europe becomes safer, NATO becomes stronger, the US reaffirms global leadership. And authoritarian states obviously just, rethink their grand plans of invasions. If Russia wins, on the other hand, it forces a pseudo-victory through negotiation, as the international system collapses in slow motion afterward. Every aggressive regime will take note, diplomacy becomes meaningless, treaties worthless, nuclear threats now become the main bargaining chips. Europe becomes fragile, and global security becomes a Russian roulette game. Pun intended. And if this becomes a frozen conflict, then, the world enters a new Cold War era, to say the least. Long, slow, corrosive, full of uncertainty, full of mistrust, full of fear. Europe will spend decades in tension. Politicians will rise and fall by referencing this conflict and analyzing them, giving their comments and statements. And the shadow of war will hang over every debate, every election, every border. Countries will pour billions into military spending for years, not because they want to, but because they must, because they have to, instead of spending on education, school infrastructure. And all the while, the world's attention will shift from rebuilding to preparing, from trust to suspicion, from ambition to caution. The truth about how this war ends is harsh, painful, and deeply uncomfortable. Nobody controls the ending, not entirely. Not Ukraine, not Russia, not Europe, not America, not NATO. Nobody. Every side is fighting not only for the land, but for the future itself, for dignity, for legitimacy, for identity. This is why every scenario is terrifying, because all of them reshape the world in irreversible ways. But here is the harshest truth of them all. The war will not end simply when the guns go quiet. The war will end when the consequences settle, when the winners rebuild, and then the losers try to survive. When the world understands what has been lost and what can be saved. And until then, the ending remains unwritten, waiting, forming, approaching. Whether we are ready for it or not, the war will continue, but at some point it will end, and the consequences will be unimaginable. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support our work, the links down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.